I have to say how thrilling it is for me to be here today. Cold Spring Harbor is one of my favorite places in the world, and just having this day here is beyond my dreams for right now. Anyway, I'm going to tell you a story about how I came to be at Cold Spring Harbor in the summer of 1943. It's a rather strange story, and it starts all the way back in the fall of 1940. It was the start of my senior year at NYU. I was an undergraduate. It was my senior year at NYU. I was then a biology major, planning to stay at NYU for graduate work and to work for a Ph.D. Something happened that changed all my plans and changed my life very fundamentally, and I must say, very much for the better. Two of our football players at NYU came to the student council, which I was a member, and complained. They were very upset because our first football game of the season was to be played in Missouri, and they had just learned that our best football player, an outstanding quarterback named Leonard Bates, would not be allowed to accompany his team to the game in Missouri. And they were very upset about that. And they explained that the reason was that New York University had made a gentleman's agreement with the University of Missouri and with a number of other southern colleges that whenever a game was played in the southern school's home ground, they would keep any black athletes that belonged to their teams at home. And we thought, some of us on the student council thought that was unacceptable. We couldn't control what the southern colleges did, but we certainly didn't think that our northern university should play along, should acquiesce in that blatant kind of racism. So we decided, this was 1940, it wasn't the 60s. So we weren't going to do anything outrageous. We weren't going to take over buildings or occupy the dean's office. We decided to pass around a petition protesting what we thought was something that shouldn't be happening. It was just wrong. And so we did. We passed around a petition, and thousands of students signed it, and hundreds of faculty members did too. It was a very popular campaign. We had the slogan, "No Missouri Compromise, Bates must play." The football player was named Leonard Bates. But then, of course, with all that activity, the administration was not impressed, and Bates did not play when the team went to Missouri. He stayed home. Well, then the same sort of thing continued as the year went on in basketball. There were not many black students at NYU in those days, and we had very few black athletes. But there was one black member of the basketball team, and they were going to have a game in North Carolina, and Jim Coward was going to have to stay home for the same reason, the gentleman's agreement with the southern schools. Well, the effort to get support for this protest continued, and it grew as the year went on, and it continued into the track season. And game in Georgia, we were sending our track team to Georgia, and again, our black team member was kept home. At that point, the campaign from the standpoint of the administration was getting a bit out of hand, because the New York newspapers were picking it up, and some of the sports columnists were writing about it. And it was a matter of big money. If they had broken their contracts, they would have probably lost millions of dollars. So they just were not going to do anything about it. And they decided they had to stop this campaign, and the way they did it was to suspend the 7 students they thought were the leaders of this campaign. And I was one of them. Thank you for that. Anyway, so we were suspended for 3 months. And the result was that, first of all, I couldn't graduate with my class in May. Several of us were seniors, and none of us could graduate with our class in May. And also, I had been offered a graduate assistantship in the biology department, where I had been planning to do my graduate work, and that was withdrawn. And of course, I wouldn't have wanted to have anything to do with NYU at that point anyway. So I finished my credits that I needed to graduate over the summer, and applied to Columbia for graduate school. And one day in the fall, I knocked on Professor Theodosius Dobzhansky's door at Columbia and asked him if I could be his graduate student. That's the way it was done in those days. You just knocked on somebody's door and asked him if you could be their graduate student. And he was very nice. He thought that it would be interesting to have a female graduate student. He hadn't had one yet. And he said, sure. So I started my graduate work in the fall of 1941. And let me just take a minute to tell you why I was so excited about genetics at that point. And we knew by then a lot about what genes do, and about how they're organized on chromosomes and how you can map them and so on. But we knew very little about, first of all, about what genes are made of and how they do the remarkable things they do. And what they do, in a nutshell, they control the hereditary traits of an organism. They determine how a fertilized egg cell turns into a human infant or a rhinoceros or a kitten. And they regulate the metabolism and the growth of the organism all throughout its life. How all that happened, we had no idea. But the most important feature of the gene that was completely mysterious and was probably the most important thing to ask about, genes copy themselves exactly every time a cell divides. And in a human adult, there are billions of cells. So there were a lot of cell divisions, and every time the cell divided, the gene was copied precisely. Except once in a while, something changed in the gene. What we call a mutation happened. And then the ability to copy itself continued, and the gene copied its changes. So this was all pretty remarkable, and we knew of no molecule that could do this sort of thing. And that was the mystery that was central in my thinking, and it's what kept me awake nights when I was starting my graduate work, wondering how on earth this could happen. At any rate, after a couple of years of courses, I was getting ready to think about what I wanted to do for my Ph.D. research. And in a class of Professor Dobzhansky's in 1943, he gave me a preprint of an article that was going to be published very soon. It was by two scientists named Salvador Luria and Max Delbruck. And what this paper essentially did was prove that bacteria have genes like other organisms. That wasn't known. I mean, most bacteriologists at that point thought that bacteria simply respond to the environment and undergo changes that were environmentally dictated. But this paper, I was given this preprint and asked to report on the paper in class. And when I reported on this paper, I jumped up and down with excitement, figuratively. And Professor Dobzhansky recognized that I was very excited about this, and he suggested that if I thought the work with bacteria was going to be so exciting, that perhaps I should think about doing my graduate research with E. coli instead of with fruit flies as I had planned. And the reason I was so excited about bacteria as a new tool for genetics was that they can divide as rapidly as every 20 minutes. Overnight, one bacterial cell can produce 1 billion in a little test tube you can hold in your hand. And it seemed to me that this would open up directions that that were extremely important for the future of genetics. So anyway, then Professor Dipshansky suggested that if I wanted to do my graduate research with E. coli, that perhaps I should spend the summer of 1944 at Cold Spring Harbor. Because Luria Delberg would be there for the summer, and so would a lot of other scientists, and bacterial genetics was already being born there. There was work going on. It was the beginning of the work on bacterial genetics. That was not the only place it was going on, but it was one of the major ones that was starting out. And at that point, my husband was about to go into the Army, so I could just pick up and go to Cold Spring Harbor, which I did for the summer of 1944. Try to describe the way I felt my first day in Cold Spring Harbor. It's a little hard to describe. I was starstruck. I was overwhelmed with the feeling that here I was in a place where all this wonderful research was going on, and I was going to be allowed to take part in it. And I had the feeling, and it really was true, that every morning when I walked into that lab, it felt as if I was walking into a cathedral. At any rate, my first day, Miloslav Dameritz, who was the director of the lab, who was going to be my supervisor while I was working there, handed me a culture of E. coli and pointed to an ultraviolet lamp and said, "Okay, go, induce mutations." So, of course, I had never had a course in microbiology. I didn't know about sterile technique. I didn't know anything, and I didn't know where to start. But some kind people in the lab gave me a few tips, and I was able to set things up and start doing an experiment. And my first day, it was a kind of beginner's luck, I guess. I made a discovery, almost by accident. I discovered a radiation-resistant mutant of E. coli. It was a mutant that could withstand at least 100 times more ultraviolet light, and later we found 100 times more X-ray exposure than the parent strain. And this was a permanent hereditary change. And at that time, the idea that a single mutation could cause that kind of increase in resistance to radiation was quite interesting, especially in view of the fact, although I didn't know it, some of the physicists who were there at the lab did know that the bomb was coming, and that a lot of people were going to be, if it was used, would be exposed to very high doses of radiation. So a mutation that affected resistance to radiation had some interest. At any rate, I theoretically came for the summer, but it turned out I stayed for 11 years until 1955. I got my Ph.D. from Columbia in 1947. Actually, my study of the radiation-resistant mutant turned into my Ph.D. problem. And after that, I stayed on as Dr. Demeritz's postdoctoral fellow, and then as a member of the scientific staff. I really can't overstate the great good fortune I had of spending those years from 1944 to 1955 at Cold Spring Harbor, and being witness to, and in a small way participating in the birth of molecular biology. And actually I continued to have a lot to do with Cold Spring Harbor after I left. I went back many summers to teach the bacterial genetics course there, and continued to attend many of these Cold Spring Harbor symposia, at which so many of the great discoveries of those decades were announced. And then I got to meet some of the world's finest scientists, and most of them turned out also to be the most admirable human beings that I ever knew. And all of this was a consequence of having been suspended for what may be called premature civil rights activism. Oh, well. It took a number of years, but eventually NYU, Harvard, and many of the other universities that had had similar gentlemen's agreements with the Southern colleges finally discarded those agreements and no longer benched their black athletes when games were played in the South. Well, I'll end with a little happy note, something that happened in 2001, very unexpected. This was exactly 60 years after we were suspended in 1941. NYU invited the 7 of us to be the guests of honor at a banquet where they, in effect, apologized to us for the suspension, telling us that we had been right and the university had been wrong. And this story was on the front page of the New York Times that morning, and it was all over local television that evening. And I was glad that all of us were there. And I was glad that we could share the event, as we did, with many of our grandchildren. It was very gratifying.